Samsul came from Aceh, Indonesia. At that time, he lived with his parents, who worked as palm oil farmers in their village, leading a modest life. Samsul, who was entering adulthood, had no job aside from helping his parents with farming, earning only a small income. Due to this situation, Samsul developed an ambition to escape poverty by imagining migrating to the city. After he was resolute in his decision, in 2005, at the age of 26, Samsul ventured alone to Medan, driven by sheer determination. Once in Medan, he began searching for work and eventually found a job as a market laborer. His first few years went smoothly, without any issues. However, in 2008, while visiting a nightclub, Samsul got into a dispute with someone that escalated into a heated altercation. During the incident, the other person tragically died from injuries that were unintentional. Since this took place in a public area, Samsul was arrested by the police before he could flee. While in custody, Samsul became involved in another dispute that also resulted in someone's death. In 2008, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. After several years in prison, Samsul began to change. He frequently participated in religious activities and engaged in positive self-development programs in the correctional facility. In short, after serving 15 years, in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic struck Indonesia, good news arrived for some inmates, including Samsul. The government launched an assimilation program to reduce the sentences of well-behaved inmates who had served more than half their sentence. Since Samsul had shown good behavior and had served more than half his sentence, in 2020, at the age of 41, he was finally released. After his release, Samsul returned to his hometown in East Aceh. Back in his village, he resumed living with his parents and reintegrated with the local community. He started working again on the palm oil plantation in his village. Every time he went to the plantation, he would pass a small house located deep within the plantation, far from the residential area. At first, Samsul was curious about who lived in the house because of its remote location. After passing by several times, Samsul accidentally saw a young woman hanging clothes in the yard of the house. Since Samsul was already 41 years old and had never fulfilled his biological needs, his mind was momentarily distracted when he saw the woman, who looked like a young mother. Initially, Samsul was content just watching her from a distance, thinking she lived alone. A few days later, he asked his friends about her, but they didn't know either. The woman living in that house was identified as DN, a young mother. DN actually lived there with her husband, in the house located deep within the palm oil plantation, far from the village. Due to its secluded location, a terrifying event would later take place there. However, to fully understand the chronology, we must first explore the background of DN and her husband. DN was originally from Medan, North Sumatra. In 2010, she married her first husband, Fadli, who was also from Medan. From that marriage, they had two sons. Their eldest son was named Ranga, and the youngest Rizki. Due to DN's financial difficulties, she was unable to care for both of her children, so custody was granted to Fadli, her ex-husband. Her children, especially Ranga, were dearly loved by their grandparents. Ranga, who was already in elementary school, grew up to be a good, polite, and intelligent boy. He excelled in school, consistently outperforming other students and often ranking at the top of his class. DN deeply missed her children and loved them very much. However, her ex-husband's family always allowed DN to visit and meet with Ranga and his younger brother. A few months after her divorce, DN met a man named Ayub, who was from Aceh. Not long after they got to know each other, Ayub brought DN to his hometown in East Aceh, where they got married. After their marriage, they built a modest house in the palm oil plantation, and since then, DN and Ayub lived there together, even though the house was quite far from the village. Meanwhile, Ayub worked as a fisherman, which meant he was often away from home, especially at night. Initially, everything seemed normal, and nothing unusual happened at their house, despite its remote location in the middle of the palm oil plantation. However, things changed when Samsul, a farmer who passed by their house every day on his way to the plantation, began to take notice of DN. At first, Samsul enjoyed seeing Diane from a distance. Every time he saw her at her house, it gave him motivation to work. But over time, Samsul started to feel restless and eventually gathered the courage to greet and flirt with Diane, hoping to get to know her. Diane, fearing gossip, especially since their house was located in such a secluded place, always avoided Samsul's advances, particularly when her husband was home. Nevertheless, Samsul did not give up and became more persistent, knowing that the house was far from the village. He continued to spy on and watch Diane's house. One day, Samsul saw a man enter the house, who turned out to be Ayub, Diane's husband. Only then did Samsul realize that Diane was already married. Despite this, Samsul was undeterred. He continued trying to flirt with Diane, even when her husband was at home, hoping she would act inappropriately. However, Diane kept avoiding Samsul, who frequently lurked around her house. As Samsul's behavior made Diane increasingly uncomfortable, she finally confided in her husband. She admitted that she felt scared staying alone in the house while Ayub was away fishing. Diane suggested to her husband that they bring Ranga, her son from her previous marriage, to live with them so he could keep her company. Her husband agreed, thinking it was for Diane's well-being. Afterward, Diane and her husband traveled to Medan to ask her ex-husband's family for permission to have Ranga stay with them in Aceh. At first, her ex-husband's family was reluctant to let Ranga go, especially since Ranga was excelling in school and very enthusiastic about his studies. However, because Diane, as his biological mother, earnestly pleaded, and with Ranga also wanting to live with his mother, her ex-husband's family eventually gave their consent. Ranga was brought to Aceh to live with Diane and Ayub, who wholeheartedly accepted him as if he were his own son. They quickly arranged for Ranga to transfer schools to Aceh. Although it was difficult at first because Ranga wasn't used to the local language, he soon adapted and blended in with his new friends. Ranga was known as a loyal and kind-hearted child, which made many of his friends enjoy being around him. At one point, none of his friends bought snacks because they didn't want to leave one of their classmates without any. That was just the kind of child Ranga was, always beloved wherever he went. After Ranga started living with them, Diane felt more at ease, knowing that at least she wasn't alone when her husband was away fishing. However, Samsul continued to watch and monitor Diane from a distance. He even knew when Diane's husband was away fishing and when he was home. Understanding the perfect timing, on the afternoon of October 10th, 2020, after returning from the plantation, Samsul observed Diane's house to ensure that her husband wasn't home. Once he confirmed this, Samsul went back to his own home. Later that night, around 2 a.m., having made up his mind, Samsul took a machete and stealthily made his way to Diane's house. At that time, Diane was at home with Ranga, who was fast asleep. Upon arriving, Samsul peered through the gaps in the house to confirm once again that Diane's husband was not present. After verifying this, Samsul broke through the wooden door and managed to enter the house without waking Diane or Ranga. Samsul approached Diane, who was asleep, and began to harass her. Diane woke up in shock to find a stranger beside her. She immediately screamed and tried to resist, which woke Ranga, who also started screaming for help. Diane told Ranga to run and find help, but Ranga, unable to bear seeing his mother in danger, approached Samsul to protect her. In a panic, Samsul swung the machete he had brought, injuring Ranga. Ranga collapsed with severe wounds. Seeing her son hurt, Diane fought to protect Ranga. However, Samsul pushed her down, and Diane kept urging Ranga to escape. Though gravely wounded, Ranga still attempted to get up and fight back. Samsul attacked Ranga again, and eventually, Ranga fell and stopped breathing. Seeing Ranga motionless, Diane became even more frantic, screaming for help. But since their house was in the middle of the palm oil plantation, and it was the middle of the night, no one could hear her cries. Samsul then dragged Diane out of the house, about 50 meters away. There, Samsul assaulted Diane, who continued to resist and scream. Because of her resistance, Samsul tied her hands and feet and threatened her not to fight anymore. Exhausted and weakened, Diane could no longer resist. Samsul continued his assault until he was satisfied. After realizing what he had done, especially to Ranga, who was now lifeless, Samsul began to panic. DN, who had fainted, was then woken up by Samsul. He threatened her, demanding she help him dispose of Ranga's body in the river. DN refused, begging him not to do that to her son. In a state of panic, Samsul hurried back to the house, took Ranga's body, and placed it in a sack. He then carried Ranga's body and disposed of it in the river. Afterward, Samsul returned to where DN had been tied up, only to find that she was no longer there. DN had managed to escape by freeing herself from the bindings. Panicking, Samsul frantically searched for DN around the plantation but couldn't find her. He decided to head home before daylight. Meanwhile, DN, who had escaped, ran as fast as she could towards the village to seek help. By dawn, the village was in an uproar upon seeing DN in a hysterical state. She recounted everything that had just happened to her. Shocked, the villagers helped DN while others reported the incident to the nearest police station. Soon after, the villagers, accompanied by the police, rushed to DN's house to investigate. Upon arriving, they found that Ranga was no longer there. The house was in disarray, and there were pools of red liquid on the floor. That morning, the police immediately began an investigation to uncover what had truly transpired. DN was taken to the hospital to be treated and calmed, as she was severely traumatized by the events. Not long after, her family, including her husband who had just returned from fishing, arrived at the hospital. At this point, everyone started to wonder who the perpetrator was. DN, who didn't know Samsul's name or identity, could only provide a description of his appearance. Meanwhile, the police, with the help of many villagers, began searching the village and surrounding areas to look for Ranga, who had not yet been found. At the same time, the police also began their investigation, relying solely on the description DN had given of the perpetrator. Due to the description matching Samsul, and with Samsul being known in the village as a former convict recently released from prison, suspicion immediately fell on him. When the police arrived at Samsul's house, they found him there, having just returned. According to his family, Samsul wasn't home during the incident at DN's house. With the police and furious villagers aiding in the search, they finally received information on October 11, 2020, about Samsul's whereabouts. He had been hiding in a palm plantation approximately 1 kilometer from the village. The police and villagers immediately moved in, and eventually the police found Samsul there. However, when they attempted to arrest him, Samsul resisted with a machete, forcing the police to fire 3 shots into his legs to subdue him. Afterward, Samsul was taken directly to the local police station, where he was questioned and interrogated. The police immediately asked Samsul where he had disposed of his son Ranga's body, but he refused to answer their questions and insisted on remaining silent. Due to Samsul's stubbornness, the case was handed over to the Langsa Police Department, and he was taken there for further questioning. After being thoroughly interrogated, Samsul finally admitted that he had thrown Ranga's body into the river. Following this confession, the police, assisted by an evacuation team and many villagers, began to search the river and its surroundings. By the afternoon, they successfully found Ranga's body floating at the riverbank. This news devastated DN and her family, especially her former husband's family in Medan, who were shocked to learn what had happened to Ranga. The case quickly gained national media coverage, shocking the entire country regarding the actions of this individual. Meanwhile, all of Indonesia admired Ranga's heroic act, willing to fight to protect his mother's honor. With his bravery, may many good prayers be offered for him. I must admit that Ranga was not only intelligent, but also loyal and courageous. Ultimately, Ranga became a real-life hero, his story ending in a noble manner. During his interrogation, Samsul confessed and recounted everything he had done. He admitted that he could not control his desires when he saw DN, and that he had desperately planned everything, even killing Ranga when he tried to protect his mother from this despicable act. He also confessed that he felt compelled to eliminate Ranga out of fear that he might escape and report the incident to the villagers. As a result, he faced the prospect of severe penalties, including a life sentence or the death penalty. However, while being held at the Langsa Police Department, Samsul refused to eat or drink for several days. When the police checked on him, they found that Samsul had already succumbed to severe dehydration due to his refusal to consume food or water. He reportedly went on a hunger strike, deeply regretting what he had done. What are your thoughts on this case? What lessons can be learned from it? Please share your answers in the comments.